and welcome to First Look, a Bible study looking ahead to the reading or readings for the coming Sunday. My name is Carl, and it's really good to have you with us. This week we're looking at another parable of Jesus, in which he contrasts someone who trusted in his own righteousness with someone who knew his profound need of God's mercy. Before we dive into any of that, however, if you've not done so already, you might find it useful to download the sheet accompanying this study, and you can find the link for that in the video description in YouTube. On the sheet you will find the text of today's reading, some other passages you may wish to look up, the questions we'll be considering together later on, and lots of room for you to record your own thoughts and observations. So without further ado then, let's dive into today's passage, which comes from Luke's Gospel, chapter 18, verses 9 to 14. We're continuing our look at Jesus' journey from Galilee to Jerusalem. That began in chapter 9, verse 51, when Jesus set his face to go there, and will conclude when we reach chapter 19, verse 27, when he enters the city on what we now call Palm Sunday. Now, at the end of chapter 17, Jesus had been teaching his disciples about the return of the Son of Man and the breaking in of the kingdom of God, in response to a Pharisee who'd asked when the kingdom of God would break in. That covers chapter 17, verses 20 through to 37. And he'd used very stark and apocalyptic imagery to lay out those things. In chapter 18, we begin with two parables that follow on from those things and seem to come as a pair. The parable of the unjust judge, in verses 1 to 8 of chapter 18, in which we explored last week, and now the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector in verses 9 to 14. Now in this text we have Jesus travelling on the road to Jerusalem and teaching and preaching and healing as he proclaimed the kingdom of God, and being followed not just by his own disciples but by large crowds, including, as we noted in chapter 17, some of the Pharisees. Now the Pharisees were one of the main factions within the lively and diverse Judaism of Jesus' day, and they were people who were really committed to a radical holiness and a centering of the importance of living out the law of Moses and the oral law, which was intended to interpret that for everyday life. In the story, we also have a tax collector. Now, tax collectors were generally despised by the society around them. They were collecting taxes on behalf of the Roman Empire, which was oppressing the people of Judea. And they were people who were known for skimming off a bit extra for themselves beyond what they were meant to collect. So not only were they collaborators, but they were exploiters of their own people, and were pretty much universally despised. So there's a real contrast between the two characters in this parable. Now Luke's Gospel was the third of the four canonical Gospels to be written around 80 to 85 of the Common Era, and it forms volume 1 of a two-part work, along with the book of Acts. It contains a number of parables that are unique to this Gospel, and today's is no exception to that. It does, however, pick up on a theme that runs throughout Luke's Gospel. So we might look, for example, back to chapter 5, verse 30, when we see a Pharisee objecting to the company that Jesus keeps. In particular, he's hanging out with tax collectors and sinners. If we look to chapter 7, verses 36 to 50, we find a named Pharisee, Simon the Pharisee, getting really upset because a woman had anointed Jesus with her hair, a woman who was probably a sex worker. And also in Luke 15, verses 1 and 2, we again find Pharisees grumbling and judging the company that Jesus kept, causing him later in chapter 15 to launch into 3 lost and found parables that seek to challenge that mindset. So this contrast between Pharisees and tax collectors is an important theme for Luke. It runs throughout the Gospel. Now today's passage begins with a statement that Jesus' target audience here were people who trusted that they were righteous. Thus they were people who closely followed the law of Moses and who looked at others with contempt. Now the term in verse 9 that's translated as trusted in themselves is also found in chapter 11 verse 22 in reference to a strong man who puts his trust in his own strength but is eventually overcome by someone even stronger than him, showing the flimsiness of where he'd put his trust. And the term that's rendered as looked with contempt is also used in chapter 23 verse 11 by Herod and the others, Herod's soldiers and the others who looked at Jesus with contempt, and also later on in Acts chapter 4 verse 11 to talk about those who rejected Jesus. So it gives us a sense of where this parable is going quite early on. Now in verse 10, Jesus describes 2 people going up to the Jerusalem temple, where he himself was headed. They'd gone up to pray. One of them was a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. Now it's important at this point to note that the way the Pharisee is depicted in this parable is not a way that we can kind of look at and go, yes, that's the way all Pharisees were like. We cannot stereotype, and too often in the Christian tradition we have resorted to very negative stereotypes of Jewish leaders that we've then projected onto Jewish people today. We need to move away from that and recognise that Jesus is not seeking to demonise the Pharisees here. He's seeking to make a very particular point that we'll come to. And similarly, we can't be under any illusion that all tax collectors were repentant. Indeed, many of them enjoyed the wealth and status that they had with their particular role. But we do see time and again, as I've already hinted at least some of the tax collectors were hopeful people who did turn to Jesus. Now, I don't think it's an accident that this particular story was set in the Jerusalem temple, because that was a place where you really couldn't get away from who you were. And it was a place where divisions between religious insiders and outsiders were laid bare. There was no getting away from that. And yet if we look to the events following Jesus' crucifixion in chapter 23 verse 45, the curtain of the temple was torn in two, erasing those divisions that we so often erect between ourselves and others, the us and them kind of behaviour, rejecting all of those divisions before God, flattening them out. Now we're told at the beginning of verse 11 that when the Pharisee went into the temple, he stood apart from others who were there. Now that might reflect a particular view of holiness, which does have a grounding in the law of Moses, an understanding of holiness as being set apart from others. So it could be that his posture is reflecting that view that was meant to characterise all of God's people. Now it's interesting when we're tempted to judge the Pharisee in this story that what he says about himself in verses 11 and 12 is entirely true. He wasn't a thief or a rogue or an adulterer, and he wasn't like this tax collector who was a collaborator and exploiter. And he was someone who fasted. He was someone who gave away 10% of his income. In other words, he was someone who tithed. In other words, he did do what was required under the law of Moses. And you might suggest that in some ways, that's the kind of person you'd like as a church member. Someone who is holy and doesn't do things we might consider bad and gives generously to the church and so on. But he's kind of missed the point of the blessing that he has. If he'd said, there but for the grace of God go I in his prayer, he would have responded much more helpfully than looking down his nose at others, and in particular at the tax collector. The issue, therefore, is not that he is telling falsehoods about himself and bigging himself up dishonestly, but that he's relying on himself, is trusting in his own righteousness rather than in God, which takes us back to what Jesus has said in verse 9 about the purpose of telling this story in the first place. Now, by contrast, as we see if we look at verse 13, the tax collector is all too aware, it seems, of his own shortcomings, and he knows that he's committed many offences against the law of Moses, and he has no righteousness of his own to stand upon. He dare not come too close to the heart of the temple, to the Holy of Holies, where God was believed to dwell, and nor could he bring himself to look up to heaven. Instead, he beats his breast, which was a visible sign of being repentant, and repeatedly begs to God for mercy. He's depicted, I think, less as humble and more as desperate, actually. He knows his profound need of God and responds accordingly. And that's why at the beginning of verse 14 we learn that he is the one who goes home justified, in other words, made right with God, because he's relying completely on God's goodness and mercy rather than his own righteousness or accomplishments. Indeed, the Pharisee in this story comes across as smug because he believes that he's genuinely better than others, while this tax collector, as I say, knows that he's not and responds with that honesty. The conclusion of the parable about the humble being exalted and vice versa echoes what we find in the gospel reversal of the Magnificat in chapter 1 verse 52, where we're told that God will put down the mighty and lift up the lowly, that beautiful, powerful song of justice which Mary sings. And Jesus states this truth in full when he's dining with a Pharisee. He mentions in chapter 14 verse 11. I think the thrust of this parable is that it's ever so easy to end up being like the Pharisee, to make our faith into a kind of holiness movement that causes us to look down on others and be condemnatory. And too often the church has been like that, so quick to set ourselves up as morally superior to others, when the reality is that, like the tax collector, we are all sinners and we all need God's grace. The question is, are we able to recognise that and respond accordingly? Flip side of that perhaps is maybe, are we able to recognise that we are beloved children of God and not to practice a false humility that puts ourselves down when we're also made in God's image and capable of great goodness? So it's a really challenging parable. You can look at it in different ways and perspectives. And it's one where perhaps the first straightforward, obvious interpretation, in inverted commas, is really not the most helpful. With that in mind, we now turn to our questions for this week.